Free Japan Channel number 25. Today, March 30th, Saturday, 2024. Time is 8 p.m. here in Kyoto. Now I am in Maizuru. The harbor is very famous here in Maizuru, Kyoto Prefecture of Japan. Today's FGC is broadcast from Kyoto. Dear listeners, how are you doing? Today's theme of FGC is why was Franklin Roosevelt so hostile to Japan? This is the topic of tonight's FGC. Franklin Roosevelt was elected as American president in 1933 after Hoover. Roosevelt was Democrat president, and exceptionally, he worked as president more than 8 years. Normally, American presidents have their own terms, at most 8 years, but it was an exception that Franklin Roosevelt was president during 4 terms, and during the 4th term he died. So if Franklin Delano Roosevelt, F.D. Roosevelt, died as president. Looking back now, Roosevelt was the president who was so hostile to Japan that Japan-US relationship became worse and worse in the 30s and 40s. It is often said that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born in the family which had so strong tie with China or Chinese clan. But we can't explain the Pacific War or the start of the Pacific War only because Franklin Delano Roosevelt had some connections, personal connection or connection of family with China or Chinese influential clans. There were other reasons that Roosevelt was so hostile to Japan at that time. In fact, Japan depended on the United States for oil, and oil was a crucial resource at that time for Japan, not only for Japan but for other developed countries. Even now, oil is a very, very important natural resource all over the world. And at that time, when a country wants to wage war, oil was essential, and Japan couldn't have no oil within the territory. So Japan was importing oil mainly from the United States. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt had the key of Japanese essential resources, oil, in his hand. So in this oil perspective, Japan was subject to the United States in a sense, because if the United States told Japan that it wouldn't export, so the United States wouldn't export oil to Japan, then Japanese war effort as well as Japanese commercial industry go bankrupt. It is often said that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had so many subordinates which were influenced by Marxism at that time. This is a kind of conspiracy theory, so I should talk about it very carefully. But Roosevelt is now said to be the president who was so influenced by Marxism, and his subordinates were also composed of so-called communists or Marxists. And some historians argue that these subordinates and Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself tried to induce Japan to begin the war, that is to say, to attack Pearl Harbor by imposing embargo to Japan. Japanese army invaded to Vietnam, southern Vietnam. It was July and August in 1941. And this incident brought about the result that the US decided to implement embargo to Japan. United States decided not to export oil to Japan and iron. As I said, Japan was importing this oil and iron, so very important natural resources for the war. Japan was importing these resources from the United States. So, Japanese high-ranking army officials and navy officials, as well as politicians, decided to begin the war with the United States in September in 1941. So, this embargo of oil from the United States was a critical turning point of Pacific War. Japan was, in a sense, forced to begin the war with the United States by the embargo of Roosevelt administration. Did Roosevelt decide this embargo to Japan by himself? Or was there any advice from some subordinates or some other people to do so? And these subordinates around Roosevelt, who were they? Were they really Marxists? Was they really influenced by communists? Or were they the intelligent people who were sent to the Roosevelt administration from Moscow? Look, at the time, in Japan, Konoe administration and Prime Minister Konoe had so many subordinates who were influenced by Marxism at that time. And his opinion, his policy was more or less influenced by this Marxism. This is not a speculation, but fact confirmed by some political documents at the time. And the famous incident was Richard Zorge incident. This incident was most famous espionage incident in the world history. And Zoge, he was trained in the Soviet Union. Zoge was German, and he could speak, of course, German and English. And he was sent by Moscow because he was trained in Moscow to be an espionage, and he was, of course, influenced by Marxism and communism. And he came to Japan via Shanghai. Zoge was gathering information in German embassy in Tokyo, and he got also a good colleague, espionage colleague, in Japanese journalist Hotsumi Ozaki, Ozaki was, in fact, the subordinate of Konoe, and Ozaki was in the position to know what Konoe was thinking about and what Konoe administration decides from Konoe himself. And Ozaki told the secret to Zoge, and Zoge sent the content which he gathered from other German soldiers and also from Ozaki and other information source to Moscow. This secret information was so important because Zoge predicted the start of German-Soviet Union war in 1941. It was in June 22, and Zoge predicted it. And after that, he also sent the secret information, that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union in September 1941 because this September Japan decided to fight against the United States. It means Japan could not wage war with the Soviet Union. Then Stalin, the leader of Soviet Union at that time, decided to withdraw so many soldiers and tanks, planes from Manchuria to Western Front to the battle with Germany, Hitler Germany. 1930s, 1940s were the time, as you now know, that there were so espionage or intelligent people who influenced the stream of politics of each country, not only in Japan, but also in the United States. So today's topic: why was Franklin Roosevelt so hostile to Japan at the time? Perhaps one of the reasons was that his subordinate and Roosevelt himself were more or less affected by communism and Marxism. And these people tried to wage war against Japan. Then the Soviet Union was safe from the battle against Japan. So the Soviet Union could concentrate on the battle against Germany. Then the Soviet Union won the war with Hitler, and United States could start the war because Japan attacked Pearl Harbor because of the perspective of oil shortage. Japanese high-ranking politicians and army and navy officials thought that Japan wouldn't move. Japan couldn't put up with that situation without oil. 2 years, approximately 2 years were the limit that they calculated. So Japanese high-ranking people calculated that they could have oil at the time. 1941, December. So December 8th, Pearl Harbor attack was the most suitable timing for Japanese Navy and Army that they could still make use of their oil, which they had in Japanese territory. And they also wanted to invade Indonesia because Indonesia had at the time very famous oil spring at that time. So Japanese Army and Navy headed for Indonesia immediately after Pearl Harbor. Of course, this was for oil getting. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a very ominous US president for Japanese people and Japanese history. And perhaps this is a kind of conspiracy theory, as I said, but perhaps he was also influenced by his so-called red subordinate, like Prime Minister Konoe at the time. Thank you.